The cold of the Minnesota winter seemed to seep through the walls of the Maple Rest Care Facility. It wasn't just the weather. It was the room itself. The fluorescent lights hummed with a pale, bluish glow, making everyone look sick. An electric heater in the corner made a soft, hissing sound, failing to fight off the chill. Outside the large window, fat, wet snowflakes slapped against the glass and slid down, blurring the world into a gray watercolor painting. Eleanor Langford sat there, 75 years old, in the wheelchair her daughter-in-law Sloane had insisted she use. Sloane stood behind her now, hands resting on the handles, a gesture that was meant to look caring but felt like a cage. Her perfume, something expensive and sharp, cut through the sterile scent of the room. Eleanor's son Parker stood in front of her. At 46, he still had the nervous energy of a boy who was in trouble. He avoided her gaze, his eyes darting from the papers in his hand to the professionally smiling man beside him. Dr. Avery Conincade. Just sign it, Mom. Parker placed the thick file on the small table in front of her. It's just some routine medical forms for your own good. Sloane's grip tightened on the wheelchair. What Parker means is we're here to help Eleanor, to make sure you're taken care of. Dr. Conincade nodded, his smile never wavering. It's a simple assessment, Mrs. Langford. Nothing to worry about. Sloane pulled out an expensive-looking fountain pen. The cap came off with a soft click, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the tense silence. She placed it on top of the documents. Eleanor's heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, suddenly grew calm. The training from her years as the union treasurer took over. Fear receded, focus took its place. She ignored their faces, their placating words, their lies. Her eyes went directly to the paper on top. She didn't need her reading glasses to see the bold black letters of the title. It was clear as day. It read, Comprehensive Cognitive Assessment and Full Medical Power of Attorney. This wasn't a checkup. It was a coup. Eleanor slowly raised her head, her gaze passing over her son's pale, anxious face. She didn't stop there. She looked past him, past the doctor, and locked eyes with the person truly in charge. She stared directly at Sloane. 3 weeks after they buried her husband Arthur, the scent of funeral lilies had finally faded from the house. It was replaced by the smell of brewing coffee and old paper. Her warm oak kitchen, the heart of their home for 50 years, had become a war room. The kitchen table, usually set for family dinners, was now covered in stacks of documents, pension statements, union contracts, and legal pads filled with Eleanor's sharp, precise handwriting. Her best friend Nora Beckett sat across from her, reading glasses perched on her nose. Her presence was a comfort, a link to the past, but even she looked grim. On the center of the table, a speakerphone crackled to life. "All right, Julian, are you there?" Eleanor's voice steady, despite everything. Loud and clear. Beatrice came the slow, gravelly voice of Julian Crow, their lawyer and friend for 40 years. "Let's get our ducks in a row." Eleanor nodded at Nora. "I saw the writing on the wall at the funeral, Julian." The way Sloane looked at Parker, the questions she asked about Arthur's benefits. She's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And Parker is just letting her lead him by the nose, Nora added, disgust lacing her words. He's so desperate for a win after that last business venture went belly up, which is why we need to act now. Eleanor tapped a thick document titled IRRSA. "I won't let my son's foolishness or his wife's greed destroy what Arthur and I built. I need a fortress, Julian, an ironclad, legally untouchable fortress. And a fortress you shall have," Julian's voice assured them from the speaker. "We'll build it with 3 walls. Wall number 1 is the QLAC. Think of it as a time-locked vault. We'll put the bulk of the capital in there. Not even you can touch it until you're 85. It immediately stops any kind of cash grab dead in its tracks. Wall 2, the Spendthrift Trust," he continued. "This is our legal fence. We'll transfer the income-generating assets into it. The trust pays out your living expenses, but the principal is untouchable by outsiders. So if Parker's creditors come sniffing around, or if Sloane convinces him to make some catastrophic investment, this trust legally tells them to get lost." Nora was already pulling the necessary paperwork from a file feeding documents into the scanner on the corner of the table. "And the final piece," Julian said, his voice lowering slightly, "is the most important. It's the tripwire." "Oh, We'll structure the trust with a no-contest clause and lock you in as the sole trustee. The clause will be very specific. If any immediate family member, namely Parker, challenges your competency or initiates guardianship proceedings, they are automatically and permanently disinherited. They get nothing, not a single red cent. It's harsh, Nora murmured, not looking up from her task. It's necessary, Eleanor countered. It's a deterrent, a shield. Nora reached into an old box of Arthur's files, pulling out a dusty ledger from the early days of the fund. As she opened it to scan a specific page detailing the initial seed money, her hand paused. It was just for a second, a barely noticeable hesitation. Her breath caught. Eleanor noticed immediately. "What is it, Nora?" She flinched, then quickly straightened the page on the scanner, her movements suddenly brisk. Nothing, she said a little too quickly. "Just dust, you know. It's hard looking at his handwriting. Arthur kept so many things." It was the first time Nora had ever lied to Eleanor. A cold prickle ran across her skin, but she decided to let it go. For now, there were more important battles to plan. "The papers are on their way to you now, Julian," Nora said, her voice back to normal. The printer on the sideboard began to spit out signature pages. Eleanor watched the black ink form the complex legal language that would protect her life's work. Each page was a brick in her fortress. Nora got up and stamped each one with a red notary seal. The thud of the stamp was a final decisive sound. Eleanor's grief for Arthur was still a raw, open wound, but in that moment it was channeled into a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a treasurer getting ready for an audit, and she would not be found wanting. The first crack in the dam appeared 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Weak sunlight filtered through the living room window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Eleanor was sitting in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, a half-finished cup of peppermint tea on the table beside her. The house was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence that follows a long life lived within the same four walls. Then the silence was broken by the crunch of tires on the snow-covered driveway. Eleanor glanced out the window and saw a sleek black SUV, the kind that costs more than her first house. Parker and Sloane. A few moments later, they were standing in her living room, bringing the cold air in with them. Sloane was all smiles, handing Eleanor a small, elegantly wrapped box. "We brought you some tea, Eleanor, from that little shop you like downtown." Parker just stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Hi, Mom. Thank you, Sloane. Parker, it's lovely to see you both." Eleanor motioned for them to sit on the sofa opposite her. Sloane sat down with perfect posture. A living room predator in a cashmere coat. Parker slumped into the cushions beside her. "We were just worried about you." Sloane began getting straight to the point after a few moments of small talk. "All alone in this big house. The winters here are no joke. I've managed for 75 winters, dear. I think I've got the hang of it." Eleanor took a sip of her tea. Sloane let out a soft, rehearsed laugh. "Oh, I know. You're tough as nails. But we were talking, and there are some wonderful new communities now. They're not like the old nursing homes. They're more like resorts. They have chefs' activities, on-site medical staff. It's about ensuring your safety, giving you and us peace of mind." She was a master of her craft. Every word was carefully chosen, dipped in honey, to hide the poison underneath. She wasn't talking about a home. She was talking about a cage. Eleanor looked at her son, waiting for him to say something to defend her or the home he grew up in. He just stared at his hands, refusing to meet her eyes. He was a stranger sitting on her sofa. As Sloane continued to paint a picture of this luxurious prison, a phone buzzed on the glass coffee table between them. It was Parker's. The screen lit up, and even from across the room, Eleanor could clearly see the caller ID, H. Pike. Parker snatched the phone as if it were a hot coal, his thumb fumbling to silence the call. He shoved it deep into his pocket, a flush creeping up his neck. He still didn't look at her. The name meant nothing to Eleanor then, but her treasurer's brain filed it away instantly. H. Pike. It was a piece of data that didn't fit, a loose thread. The conversation petered out after that. Eleanor's polite but firm refusals to discuss the matter further left Sloane with nowhere to go. They stood up to leave. "Well, we just want you to think about it," Sloane said. Her smile stretched a little too thin. As they walked toward the foyer, her eyes swept across the living room. Her gaze paused just for a second on the old cast-iron safe that stood in the corner, the same safe that had been there for 40 years. It was a quick, almost imperceptible glance, but Eleanor saw it. She saw the flicker of calculation, of greed. Arthur was always so careful, Sloane said, her voice light and casual. I imagine the Steel Workers Union had its share of bad debts and shady characters back in the day. He must have kept everything under lock and key. My husband was a man of integrity, Eleanor said, her voice turning cold as the winter air outside. He protected what was his. The subtle jab hit its mark. A flash of annoyance crossed Sloane's face before she smoothed it over with another perfect smile. Of course. We'll call you tomorrow, Eleanor. Eleanor watched from the window as they got into their black SUV and drove away, leaving perfect tire tracks in the otherwise pristine snow. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer a comfortable silence. It was the silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. They hadn't just come to visit. They had come to scout the terrain, and Eleanor knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that they would be back. To catch a fox, you have to think like a fox, and Sloane was a fox of the highest order. So Eleanor decided to set a trap baited with exactly what she was hunting for, a weakness. Her late husband's study was her sanctuary, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of old books and pipe tobacco. It was also the perfect stage. The next Thursday, knowing they were due for another one of their check-ins, she prepared it. She took out a document she'd had Julian draft a week prior. It was a single page, a laughably simple last will and testament. It left everything to Parker, but with no protections, no trusts, no legal firewalls. It was the kind of amateur document a grieving widow might write on her own, and the kind a sharp lawyer could tear to shreds in court. Eleanor folded it and placed it in the top drawer of her desk, leaving the drawer open just a crack, an invitation. The final touch was a small digital voice recorder no bigger than her thumb. It was a habit from her Union days document everything. She switched it on and tucked it behind a silver-framed photograph of Arthur and her on their wedding day. They were smiling young and unaware of the battles that would come so many years later. They arrived right on schedule, bearing a box of pastries as their Trojan horse. They went through the usual dance of polite conversation in the living room. After a few minutes, Eleanor stood up slowly. You know, I think I have that spiced tea you like so much, Sloane. Let me just go find it in the kitchen pantry. I'll be right back. It was the oldest trick in the book, but it worked. She left them alone. She didn't go to the kitchen right away. She stood in the hallway, her heart a quiet drum against her ribs, and she listened. She heard the soft creak of the study door just as she knew she would. From her listening post, she couldn't see them, but she could imagine the scene perfectly. Sloane directing Parker to stand watch at the door. Her moving with silent efficiency to the desk, the soft scrape of the drawer opening a pause, then the quiet, almost inaudible click of a phone camera. Once. Twice. The scrape of the drawer closing. A few moments later they emerged from the study, their faces perfectly composed. Sloane was smiling. No luck on that tea, Eleanor. No. I'm afraid I must have finished it, Eleanor said, matching her calm. They didn't stay long after that. The purpose of their visit was complete. As Eleanor watched their SUV pull away, she felt no sense of victory, just a sour, bitter taste in her mouth. She walked back into the study, the room still holding the faint trace of Sloane's perfume. She retrieved the recorder from behind the photograph. She sat down in Arthur's old leather chair and pressed play. She heard the rustle of their coats, their hushed whispers. Is this it? Parker's voice nervous and thin. Quiet. Sloane's sharp reply. Then the sound of the drawer, a soft gasp of triumph. Oh, you beautiful, stupid old woman. It's perfect, simple, easy to contest on grounds of diminished capacity. Eleanor heard the click of her phone. What now? Parker asked. Now we have our leverage, Sloane whispered. She thinks she's in control. Let her play her little games. Then Eleanor heard the distinct sound of a text message being sent. She knew what it said without having to see it. The fox had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. The trap was set. Now all she had to do was wait for it to spring. The final attempt at a peaceful surrender came over a dinner Eleanor neither wanted nor enjoyed. Sloane had chosen the restaurant. It was one of those new, painfully trendy places downtown where the lighting was too dim and the prices were too high. The air was thick with the buzz of loud conversations and the clatter of silverware, a constant nervous drumbeat against the backdrop of some kind of minimalist jazz music. Eleanor felt like a museum piece out of time and out of place in her simple wool dress and pearls amidst a sea of sharp suits and designer labels. They were seated at a small table draped in a ridiculously white tablecloth. Sloane sat opposite her, looking perfectly at home. Parker sat beside Eleanor, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. For the first 20 minutes, they played a game. They talked about the weather, the abysmal state of the local sports team, Parker's latest business idea that was still in the planning stages. A phrase Eleanor had come to understand meant it was already failing. It was all a carefully choreographed dance, a prelude to the main event. Sloane naturally fired the first shot. She placed her wineglass down with a delicate click. Eleanor, Parker, and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about legacy. Eleanor simply raised an eyebrow and waited. Your financial health is in excellent shape thanks to you and Arthur's incredible foresight, she continued as if she were giving a corporate presentation. But we believe in a holistic approach. It's not just about managing assets. It's about managing quality of life. We need to be proactive, not reactive. And what exactly does being proactive entail? Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously quiet. It means getting all our ducks in a row, Sloane said, leaning forward. Her smile was bright, but it never touched her eyes. It means consolidating decision-making. We found a service. Think of them as a personal CEO for your later years. They manage everything from healthcare appointments to property maintenance. And in conjunction with that, we think it's time to seriously consider that residential community we mentioned. It's a turnkey solution for your long-term comfort and our peace of mind. She made it sound like a business acquisition. Eleanor wasn't a person. She was a portfolio to be managed, a problem to be optimized. She felt a surge of ice-cold anger, but she kept her face a placid mask. She turned her head slightly to look at her son. Parker, is this what you want? He flinched, finally forced to speak. He cleared his throat and pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He unfolded it and slid it across the pristine white tablecloth. His hand was trembling slightly. It's just a formality, Mom, he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the breadbasket. It's a temporary medical power of attorney just so I can help with things. Scheduling appointments, talking to doctors in case something happens. It's just to make things easier. There it was, the knife unsheathed and laid bare on the table between them. Eleanor looked down at the document. The language was dense, but the intent was crystal clear. It wasn't temporary, and it wasn't just for scheduling appointments. It was a key to everything, to her money, to her home, to her very freedom. As she stared at it, her hand brushed against her wineglass. A few drops of deep red wine sloshed over the rim, landing on the perfect white cloth. The stain spread instantly, a dark, ugly bloom on the sterile surface. It looked like a drop of blood. No one said a word. The moment stretched thick with unspoken truths. Parker stared at the stain as if he'd committed a murder. Sloane's smile finally faltered, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap and looked from the paper to her son, and finally to her daughter-in-law. Her expression was calm, serene even. She offered them a small, soft smile. You've given me a lot to consider, she said, her voice as smooth as silk. Let me think about it. Parker looked relieved, but Sloane wasn't fooled. A silent understanding passed between the two women. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. 2 days later, Eleanor found herself back at Maple Rest Care Facility. The moment she'd been preparing for had arrived. She stared at the document, the title burning itself into her memory. Comprehensive Cognitive Assessment and Full Medical Power of Attorney. The room was silent. The only sounds were the hiss of the heater and the wet slap of snow against the window. All three of them, her son, his wife, and their hired gun doctor, were watching her, waiting for her to pick up the pen, waiting for the old woman to surrender. Eleanor folded her hands on her lap over the thick wool of her coat. She raised her head and let her gaze rest on Parker. His face was a mask of anxiety sweat beading on his upper lip. He couldn't hold her eye for more than a second. "No," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "I will not be signing this. Not today. Not ever." Parker flinched as if she'd struck him. "Mom, please." He started, his voice a desperate whisper. "Don't make this difficult. We're just trying to help. It's for your own good, I swear." "My own good," she repeated the words, tasting like ash. "You bring me here under false pretenses. You ambush me with a doctor I've never met, and you try to trick me into signing away my rights. How exactly is any of that for my good Parker?" He had no answer. He just looked helplessly at his wife. Sloane stepped forward, her placid smile finally gone, replaced by a look of cold impatience. She cut Parker off before he could stammer out another word. "Very well, Eleanor. We had hoped to do this the easy way." She turned to Dr. Conincade. "Doctor, would you be so kind as to give us a moment?" Conincade nodded, ever the professional, and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Sloane pulled a sleek smartphone from her purse and tapped the screen. A man's face appeared sharp and severe in a lawyer's suit. He was on a video call. "Mark, are you ready?" Sloane asked. "Ready when you are." "Sloane," the lawyer's tiny voice replied from the phone speaker. "The petition for emergency conservatorship is drafted and ready to file. I just need the word." Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Sloane held the phone up as if to make sure Eleanor could see. "Eleanor, this is your last chance. Sign the papers, and we can all go home and pretend this unpleasantness never happened. Refuse, and I will instruct Mark to file this petition with the Hennepin County Court effective immediately. They will appoint a temporary guardian, likely Parker, pending a full hearing. The choice is yours." It was a perfectly executed checkmate, or so she thought. Eleanor looked at the phone at the smug face of Sloane's lawyer. She looked at her son, who now seemed to be shrinking into the wallpaper, and she looked at Sloane, her eyes glittering with triumph. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline, the thrill of the fight she had been preparing for. She gave Sloane her answer. "Do it." Parker let out a small, strangled gasp. "Mom, no." But Sloane was already speaking. "You heard her, Mark. File it now." Filing, the lawyer's voice confirmed. Eleanor could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. "The petition has been submitted to the court's e-portal. We should receive electronic confirmation momentarily." They waited. The silence in the room was electric. Parker was pale, looking back and forth between Eleanor and Sloane, finally understanding that he was a pawn in a game far bigger than he'd imagined. Eleanor's own phone, tucked away in her purse, gave a single soft buzz. It was the confirmation she'd been waiting for. The tripwire had been triggered. The lawyer's phone on Sloane's screen pinged. "There it is," he said. "Confirmation received. The court has accepted the filing." Sloane switched off the call and turned to Eleanor, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. "It's done, Eleanor. It's over." "Oh, I don't think so," Eleanor said, a slow smile spreading across her own face. "Why don't you try calling your friends at Marrowband Capital, see if they're still interested in your little venture?" A flicker of confusion crossed Sloane's face. "What are you talking about? The trust, Sloane. The one you were so eager to get your hands on. You see, my lawyer, Julian Crow, is an old-fashioned man, but he understands modern technology. He set up an alert system tied directly to the court's filing database. The moment your lawyer filed that petition, the very second it was accepted, an automated directive was sent from Julian's office to the financial custodians of the entire $22 million fund." Eleanor let the words hang in the air, enjoying the dawning horror in Sloane's eyes. As of approximately 30 seconds ago, she continued every asset, every stock, every last dollar of the Langford Family Trust has been placed under an emergency freeze. It's now locked in a temporary, non-affiliated community trust for the next 18 months, pending an investigation into potential elder financial abuse and coercion. You can't touch it. I can't touch it. No one can. You pulled the trigger, Sloane, and you shot your own plan right in the heart. For a glorious moment, Sloane was speechless. The color drained from her face. Eleanor saw real, genuine shock. She had won. But then something strange happened. The shock faded. The color returned to Sloane's cheeks, and the look of horror was replaced by a slow, cold, terrifying smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. "Good," she said, her voice a low, triumphant hiss. "Oh, Eleanor, you magnificent old fool. You did exactly what I wanted you to do." A cold dread, colder than the Minnesota winter, crept up Eleanor's spine. "You think this was about a quick cash grab?" Sloane laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This was never about getting you to sign a piece of paper. This was about getting you to do exactly what you just did. This was about forcing a legal conflict." She took a step closer, her eyes boring into Eleanor's. "Because now by law, since you and I are contested parties in a dispute over a frozen estate, I, as Parker's concerned wife, have the legal standing to demand what I could never get before. I have the right to petition the court for a full, comprehensive forensic audit of the entire $22 million pension fund from the day it was created until today." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You built your fortress, Eleanor, and I just tricked you into handing me the battering ram. Let's open up the books, shall we? Let's see just how clean Arthur's precious legacy really is." The preliminary hearing was held in a small, stuffy courtroom in the Hennepin County Government Center. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and floor polish. Everything was wood dark, imposing and polished to a high sheen that reflected the grim fluorescent lights above. Eleanor sat beside Julian at the petitioner's table, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She was not intimidated. This was her home turf, facts, figures, and evidence. Across the room, Sloane sat with her lawyer, Mark. She projected an air of serene boredom, as if this were all a tedious but necessary formality. Parker sat behind them, looking haggard and gray. He wouldn't look at Eleanor. He wouldn't look at anyone. He just stared at a point on the far wall, a man already convicted by his own conscience. The judge, a woman named Espinosa with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the room to order. "Mr. Crow," she said, her voice crisp. "The court has reviewed the petition for emergency conservatorship filed by Mr. Parker Langford. The floor is yours." Julian rose slowly, a lion in winter. He was steady, methodical, and utterly confident. He laid out the timeline for the judge, speaking in calm, measured tones. He described the unwanted visits, the pressure, the ambush at Maple Rest. He presented Eleanor's detailed journal entries, each one dated and timed as evidence of a coordinated campaign of harassment. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "this is not a case of a concerned son. This is a case of a calculated predatory attempt to seize control of a $22 million estate by manufacturing a health crisis that does not exist." Judge Espinosa listened intently, her expression unreadable. Sloane's lawyer, Mark, occasionally made a note, but he didn't object. He was letting Julian build his case, letting him lay all his cards on the table. "And now, Your Honor," Julian announced, "we come to the smoking gun. With the court's permission, I would like to play an audio recording made by my client in her own home on the afternoon of January 24th. He placed a small digital recorder on the table and pressed a button. Eleanor's own voice filled the courtroom, clear and steady, narrating the time and date. Then, after a moment of silence, came the hushed whispers from her study. Sloane's sharp, triumphant voice, Parker's nervous replies, every word of their conspiracy to use the decoy, will against her, captured perfectly. A low murmur rippled through the few observers in the gallery. Judge Espinosa leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. Parker sank lower in his chair, his face ashen. For the first time, a flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Sloane's calm facade. They had them dead to rights. Julian switched off the recorder. "As you can hear, Your Honor, this was a premeditated plot." "Objection," Mark said, standing up smoothly. He wasn't rattled. He was calm, dangerously calm. "On what grounds, counsel?" the judge asked. "Not on the grounds of authenticity." "Your Honor," Mark said, a faint, predatory smile on his lips, "we don't dispute that the recording is of our clients. We object on the grounds of incompleteness. Mr. Crow has presented a curated snippet of a much larger picture. We believe it's only fair for the court to have the full context." Julian frowned. "Your Honor, this is a stalling tactic." "It is not," Mark interrupted. "And to prove it, we have our own audio files to submit into evidence. Recordings from the same time period, also made within Mrs. Langford's home, which paint a very, very different picture of her state of mind. A cold knot of confusion began to form in Eleanor's stomach. What was he talking about? There were no other recordings. Judge Espinosa hesitated, then nodded. The court will allow it. Proceed. Mark nodded to his paralegal, who clicked a mouse. A new voice filled the room. It was Eleanor's voice, but it wasn't her. The snow, her voice said, but it was different. It was thin, reedy, laced with a strange, trembling paranoia. It's not real snow. They're watching me through it. Arthur told me they would. The courtroom was utterly silent. Eleanor stared at the speakers, her mind reeling. She had never said those words. She had never even thought them. Julian was on his feet. Objection. Where did this come from? This is fabricated. It was recovered from the cloud backup of the same digital device your client used. Your Honor, Mark said smoothly. The metadata is intact. We have an expert ready to testify. Before Julian could respond, Mark signaled to his paralegal again. Another recording played. Eleanor's voice again, this time sounding exhausted and hopelessly confused. Parker, just take the money. Her voice sighed, a sound of utter defeat. Just take it. I can't keep track of the numbers anymore. The decimal points, they keep moving around. Just sign the papers for me, dear. You know what's best. The floor fell out from under Eleanor. That was from the decoy will meeting. But the context, the meaning, it was twisted into something monstrous. It sounded like a genuine plea from a woman who had lost her mind. It was a perfect, damning lie delivered in her own voice. What is this? She whispered, grabbing Julian's arm. Julian, what is this witchcraft? He was as stunned as she was, his face pale. He was an old warrior, a master of paper and precedent. He was completely unprepared for a ghost in the machine. He was on the ropes, and he knew it. Your Honor, Mark said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. As you can hear, Mrs. Langford is a woman in deep distress. She is suffering from delusions, memory loss. She records herself to try and keep track of reality. But as the evidence shows, her reality is tragically fractured. The recording Mr. Crow played earlier was not evidence of a conspiracy. It was a moment of paranoia, a loving son and his wife trying to calm a confused and frightened matriarch. He had taken Eleanor's greatest weapon and turned it against her. Her diligence, her meticulous record-keeping, was now being presented as proof of her own insanity. She looked around the courtroom. The observers were no longer looking at her with curiosity, but with pity. The judge's sharp, intelligent eyes had softened with concern. She was looking at Eleanor not as a petitioner, but as a patient. She saw Sloane then. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't gloating. She was watching Eleanor with a look of serene, reptilian stillness. She was the one pulling the strings, a puppeteer so skilled you could barely see the wires. Judge Espinosa cleared her throat. Given this conflicting and deeply concerning new evidence, the court finds that the petition for a full forensic audit of the Langford Family Trust is warranted and hereby granted. She looked directly at Eleanor, her voice softening. And I am scheduling a full competency hearing for Mrs. Langford in 30 days. This court will appoint an independent medical examiner. She brought the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed in the silent room. It wasn't the sound of a recess. It was the sound of a cage door slamming shut. Julian Crow's office was on the 32nd floor of a skyscraper in downtown Minneapolis. It was a place Eleanor had always associated with strength and security, a fortress in the sky. But that night, it felt like a cage. It was almost midnight. Outside the panoramic window, the city lights glittered like a carpet of scattered diamonds, cold and indifferent. Inside, the only light came from a single green banker's lamp on Julian's massive mahogany desk, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of law books. Julian was pacing his suit jacket off his tie loosened. He ran a hand through his shock of white hair, a gesture of pure frustration Eleanor had seen only a handful of times in 40 years. Deep-fake audio, he muttered the words sounding alien in his mouth. It's a ghost. How do you cross-examine a ghost? The judge looked at you like she saw a confused old woman. Their narrative is winning. Eleanor sat in one of the leather armchairs, a cup of tea, long gone cold, on the table beside her. The shock from the courtroom had subsided, leaving behind a hard, dense dread in the pit of her stomach. Nora sat in the chair next to her, silent and rigid. She hadn't said more than 10 words since they left the courthouse. She just stared into the middle distance, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The phone on Julian's desk chirped. He snatched it up. "Yeah, I see. So they're not wasting any time." "Of course they aren't. Start with the foundation." "Understood. Keep me posted." He hung up, his face grim. "That was my contact at the accounting firm the court appointed. The audit has officially begun. They've requested all founding documents, all transaction records from the first 5 years of the fund." A small choked sound escaped from Nora's throat. It was so quiet, Eleanor almost thought she'd imagined it, but Julian heard it too. He stopped pacing and looked at her. "Nora, are you all right?" She didn't answer. She just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Her gaze was still fixed on nothing. Eleanor felt that same cold prickle on her skin she'd felt in her kitchen weeks ago. The lie, the hesitation, the dust in her eyes. It was all connected. "Nora," she said, her voice low and steady. "What is it? What about the first 5 years?" Nora finally looked at her, and her eyes were filled with a terror so profound it stole Eleanor's breath. "I'm so sorry, Elle," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I should have told you years ago. I wanted to. Arthur made me promise." Julian and Eleanor exchanged a look of alarm. He pulled up a chair and sat down, his full attention now on Nora. "Promise what?" he asked, gently. The story came tumbling out, then a torrent of words held back for decades. It was a confession. It was the 3rd year of the fund she began, her words rushing together. "There was a man, Frank Miller, a smelter at the plant. Do you remember him? His wife had that terrible illness, the one the doctors couldn't figure out. His medical insurance ran out. He took out a second mortgage on his house to pay the bills, but he fell behind. The bank was going to foreclose. He was going to lose everything." Eleanor remembered Frank, a good man, quiet, who had worked his whole life at the plant. Arthur was the head of the union. Nora continued, tears now streaming down her face, leaving dark tracks on her cheeks. He tried everything. He set up a collection. He appealed to management. But it wasn't enough. They were going to be on the street in a week. Arthur, he couldn't let it happen. He said the union was a brotherhood, that it had to mean something more than just contracts and paychecks. She took a shuddering breath. So he did something. He used his discretionary authority as the fund's trustee. He made a special transaction, an undocumented capital transfer. He moved $150,000 from the pension fund's reserve account to an anonymous holding company, which then paid off the Miller family's debt. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic 32 floors below. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. He bent the rules to save a good man. Elnora pleaded, her voice a desperate whisper. He logged it as a long-term investment in a shell corporation, a ghost asset. He was going to replace the money himself over the next few years from his own salary and investments. He swore he would, but then the market took a downturn in '78, and then he got sick, and he never got the chance to fix it. He made me swear I would never tell anyone. He said it would tarnish the union's name. He said his legacy was protecting the workers, and this was part of it. Betrayal is a funny thing. It's not a loud, explosive event. It's a quiet, cold poison that seeps into your bones. Eleanor's best friend, her confidant for half a century, had sat beside her while she built her fortress, knowing all along there was a gaping, fatal hole in its foundation. And her husband, her Arthur, the man she had placed on a pedestal, the man whose honor she was fighting to defend, was not the perfect saint she remembered. He was a man who stole. He stole for the right reasons, perhaps, but he stole nonetheless. Julian finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of the law. A ghost asset, he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. An undocumented transfer of that size from a federally regulated pension fund. They're not going to call that bending the rules. They're going to call it embezzlement. They're going to call it fraud. He was right. Eleanor knew he was right. Sloane's audit wasn't a fishing expedition anymore. She hadn't just tricked Eleanor into giving her a battering ram. Nora's secret had just told her exactly where to aim it. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, turning her back on them. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked out at the glittering, indifferent city. The woman who had walked into this office tonight, the confident widow fighting for her husband's honor, was gone. In her place was a stranger, a fool who had built her life on a foundation of secrets and lies. She had never felt so completely, utterly alone. Sleep wouldn't come. Eleanor lay in the dark of her bedroom, the house silent around her, but her mind was a raging storm. Nora's confession echoed in her thoughts, a drumbeat of betrayal. Arthur's perfect image, the one she had polished and cherished for 50 years, had been shattered, and the audit Sloane's masterstroke was now underway. A team of strangers picking through the bones of her husband's life, searching for the very flaw she now knew was there. She felt trapped, outmaneuvered at every turn, a queen on a chessboard with no moves left to make. Despair is a heavy blanket. It smothers you. Sometime in the dead of night she couldn't bear it anymore. Eleanor slipped out of bed, pulling on her thick robe. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Absolution. An answer. She was just a ghost haunting her own home, a home that now felt filled with secrets. She found herself standing at the bottom of the narrow stairs leading to the attic, her hand on the cold brass knob. The attic was Arthur's domain, a dusty archive of his life's work. She hadn't been up there in years. She pulled the cord and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a weak yellow glow over a graveyard of forgotten things. Cardboard boxes stacked high and labeled in Arthur's familiar scroll. Old furniture draped in white sheets looking like sleeping giants. The air was cold and still thick with the musty scent of paper and time. Eleanor was grasping at straws, trying to find something, anything that would make sense of the man he was. The man who could save a family with one hand and sign their ruin with the other. Her eyes scanned the labels on the boxes. Contracts 1970-75, pension amendments, grievance filings. It was the history of 1,000 working men's lives, all packed away in cardboard. Then she saw a smaller stack tucked away under the eaves. The box on top was labeled simply, Disciplinary Actions. Her old treasurer's instincts, the part of her that always needed the books to balance, took over. She pulled the heavy box out and set it on an old wooden trunk. Her fingers stiff with cold, and age fumbled with the lid. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each with a name typed neatly on the tab. Most were thin files, a reprimand for tardiness, a suspension for a safety violation. But one file near the bottom was different. It was thick, at least 2 inches, held together with a thick rubber band that had gone brittle with age. She pulled it out. The name on the tab made her blood run cold. Mercer Daniel. Eleanor sat down on the trunk, the weak light from the bulb shining down on the folder in her lap. She opened it. The first page was a formal letter of dismissal, dated 1981. The reason cited gross misconduct, including embezzlement of union funds and willful negligence of safety protocols, resulting in injury to a fellow worker. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She kept reading page after page of testimony. Financial records showing small amounts of money siphoned from the workers' social fund over a period of 2 years. A report from an OSHA investigation detailing how Daniel Mercer had deliberately bypassed safety checks on a piece of heavy machinery to save time, leading to an accident that had cost another man 2 fingers. It was all there in black and white. This wasn't just a firing, it was a scandal. Arthur had been forced to bring the hammer down not just to protect the union's money, but to protect its members from one of their own. This was the story Sloane had hinted at. The bad debts and shady characters. Only the villain wasn't her husband. It was her daughter-in-law's father. Tucked into a sleeve at the back of the file was a small black and white photograph stapled to an incident report. It was a picture of Daniel Mercer being escorted off the plant premises by security. He was a man with a bitter, resentful twist to his mouth, and standing just behind the chain-link fence watching him go was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She had dark hair and pigtails and was wearing a simple dress. But it was her face that made the air leave Eleanor's lungs. Her expression. It wasn't the face of a sad child whose father had lost his job. It was the face of a soldier watching her king being overthrown. Her eyes were narrowed, burning with a hatred so pure, so adult. It was chilling. Her small mouth was set in a thin, hard line. It was a promise, a vow of vengeance. Eleanor stared at that little girl's face, at the furious fire in her eyes, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. It was Sloane. The pieces didn't just fall into place, they slammed together with the force of a tectonic shift. Her marriage to Eleanor's sweet, simple, easily manipulated son, her relentless ambition, her veiled questions about Arthur's legacy, her cold, calculated plan to dismantle Eleanor's life, not for a quick payday, but piece by painful piece. This wasn't about money. It was about revenge, a 40-year-old grudge nursed from childhood and honed into a weapon of devastating precision. The fog of despair that had clouded Eleanor's mind for days finally lifted, burned away by the cold, bright light of understanding. The fear, the grief, the feeling of being a victim, it all vanished. In its place, something new and hard settled in her chest. Ice. She stood up, the file still in her hand. She walked over to a small table where an old framed picture of Arthur and her sat covered in a thin layer of dust. Their wedding day. She looked at their young, happy faces, and for the first time since Nora's confession, she felt no confusion, no betrayal. She felt only a fierce, protective clarity. She finally knew her true enemy, and now she knew how to fight her. The battle for the money was over. The war for the truth had just begun. Eleanor sat on the old trunk in the attic, the Mercer file heavy in her lap, its weight far greater than the paper and ink it contained. The revelation burned through her like wildfire, consuming the undergrowth of confusion and despair. In its place grew something harder, more focused. Revenge. It explained everything. The careful manipulation, the strategic marriage to Parker, the patient waiting. Sloane hadn't wanted a quick cash grab. She'd wanted to destroy Arthur's legacy completely, to rip out his reputation by the roots and salt the earth where it had stood. The weak yellow bulb flickered overhead as Eleanor gathered the file and descended from the attic. Dawn was breaking, pale light seeping through the windows. She hadn't slept, but she felt more alert than she had in weeks. She called Julian and Nora, instructing them to meet her at the house immediately. This wasn't just about protecting money anymore. This was war. They arrived within the hour, concern etched on their faces. Eleanor laid the Mercer file on the kitchen table between them, open to the dismissal letter. Julian's eyebrows rose as he scanned the document. I'll be damned. So that's her angle. Nora's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the photograph of young Sloane watching her father's disgrace. The hatred in that child's eyes. It's unnatural. No child should look like that. Eleanor nodded, her face set like granite. 40 years. She's been planning this for 40 years. She didn't marry Parker for love or money. She married him to get close to Arthur, to me, to everything we built. And now she's using our own son as the weapon. Julian leaned back in his chair, the legal mind already calculating. This changes our strategy completely. We need to fight back with information, not just legal maneuvers. First, we need an expert to debunk those fake recordings, Eleanor said. Someone who can prove to the court that technology was used to manipulate my voice. Julian nodded thoughtfully. I know just the person. Young tech genius named Alex Sharma. He specializes in digital forensics. If anyone can expose those recordings as fakes, it's him. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, to the winter sky brightening outside. And we need to find Frank Miller. If he's still alive, his testimony could be crucial. He can verify that Arthur helped him, that the money wasn't stolen, but invested in a family who needed it. Nora was already pulling out her phone. I'll start looking. Union kept pretty good records of retirees. We have 30 days until the competency hearing, Eleanor said, her voice steady with new resolve. 30 days to uncover 40 years of hate. Alex Sharma's office was nothing like Julian's wood-paneled fortress of law. It was a sleek space in a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and glass filled with computers and equipment Eleanor couldn't begin to name. Alex himself defied expectation. Barely 30, with bright, intelligent eyes and the calm demeanor of someone twice his age. He listened carefully as Julian explained their situation, occasionally nodding or typing notes. "So let me get this straight," Alex said when they'd finished. "Someone took recordings of Mrs. Langford's voice and manipulated them to make her sound paranoid and confused, then presented them in court as evidence of mental decline." "Precisely," Julian confirmed. "We need to know if it's possible, and if so, how to prove it was done." Alex's eyes lit up with the challenge. "Oh, it's definitely possible. The technology is called deepfake audio. Think of it as a vocal collage. Software can take hours of someone speaking and break it down into phonemes, individual sounds, then reconstruct those sounds into entirely new sentences the person never actually said." He turned to his computer fingers flying over the keyboard. "Let me show you." He pulled up a waveform on his screen, a visual representation of sound. "Real human speech has a certain randomness, a certain organic flow," he explained, pointing to the complex, irregular patterns on the screen. "But AI-generated speech, even the best kind, leaves artifacts, unnaturally smooth transitions, identical pitch patterns on repeated words. It's subtle, but it's there if you know what to look for." Eleanor leaned forward, fascinated despite herself. "Can you detect these artifacts in the recordings they used against me, with access to the original files?" "Absolutely." Alex's confidence was reassuring. "And I can do you one better. Most commercial deepfake programs leave digital fingerprints, unique patterns in the audio that identify which software was used. If we can match those fingerprints, we might even be able to trace who created the fakes." Julian looked impressed. "How quickly can you analyze them?" "Give me the recordings in 48 hours. I'll have a full forensic report ready for court." As they prepared to leave, Alex asked one more question. "By the way, who are we dealing with? What's their technical capability?" Eleanor hesitated, then pulled out her phone. She opened the website for Mercer Public Relations. The modern, sleek page featured a smiling Sloan under the heading Founder and CEO. Their slogan caught Eleanor's eye, "Reshaping Narratives for a Digital Age." Alex whistled low. A PR firm with digital expertise. That explains a lot. They'd have both the technical knowledge and the equipment to create convincing deepfakes. The discovery of Sloane's true identity and motive had energized Eleanor, but she knew they needed more than just the why. They needed to understand the how of her plan. Back at home, Eleanor and Julian began digging into the mysterious H. Pike, the name that had appeared on Parker's phone during that early visit. Julian's investigator found the connection within days. Howard Pike was a senior partner at Marrowband Capital, a firm specializing in high-end retirement communities. More importantly, he was listed as a business associate on several of Sloane's private ventures that Parker knew nothing about. The plan came into focus with brutal clarity. Get Eleanor declared incompetent, take control of her fortune, then funnel the assets into Marrowband's newest development project, with Sloane taking a healthy commission on both ends of the deal. But understanding Sloane's scheme was only half the battle. Eleanor needed to confront her son to make him see the truth about the woman he had married. She called Parker, asking him to come alone to the house. To her surprise, he agreed. When he arrived, Parker looked terrible. Haggard, sleep-deprived, the weight of his complicity hanging visibly on his shoulders. He couldn't meet her eyes as he settled into the living room sofa. Eleanor didn't waste time on pleasantries. The Mercer file sat on the coffee table between them. She opened it and pushed it toward him. "This is your wife's father, Daniel Mercer. Arthur fired him in 1981 for embezzling from the Union's social fund and for negligence that cost another worker 2 fingers. Did you know any of this?" Parker's face drained of color as he read the dismissal letter. "She told me her father was unfairly pushed out, that Arthur targeted men he didn't like. I had no idea." Eleanor watched her son absorb the information, watched the dawning horror as he turned to the photograph of young Sloane at the factory gates. "Parker, have you ever wondered why Sloane wanted to marry you specifically? The only son of Arthur Langford." The realization hit him like a physical blow, his shoulders slumping as if under a great weight. "Oh God, I'm her weapon, her way in. And she's using you to destroy our family," Eleanor said softly. "She doesn't want the money, Parker. She wants your father's name dragged through the mud. She wants his legacy destroyed." Parker covered his face with his hands, his voice muffled and broken. I never knew. She was always so driven, so focused on our future. I thought she loved me." Eleanor felt a wave of pity for her son. He had always been searching for validation for purpose. Sloane had given him both, along with a sense of importance he'd never had, and he'd been willing to betray his own mother for it. "What do I do now?" Parker looked up, and for a moment he was a little boy again, lost and looking to her for guidance. "That depends entirely on you," Eleanor replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "You can continue being her puppet, or you can stand up and help me fight back. But you can't do both." The next week passed in a blur of activity. Alex completed his analysis of the audio recordings, confirming they were sophisticated deepfakes created using proprietary software licensed to Mercer Public Relations. Julian began preparing their counterstrike for the upcoming hearing, armed with the forensic evidence and the Mercer file. Nora, meanwhile, had tracked down Frank Miller. Now 83, he was living in a modest retirement community in Florida. Eleanor called him personally, explaining the situation and what was at stake. Frank was stunned to learn that Arthur had used pension funds to save his home. "I always wondered how we kept the house," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Arthur told me it was a special loan from the Union Bank. I paid back every penny with interest." This was the final piece Eleanor needed. Not only had Arthur helped the Miller family, but Frank had repaid the loan in full. The money hadn't been stolen. It had been invested in a family's future, and that investment had been repaid. If they could document those repayments, they could prove there was no fraud. "Would you be willing to testify to this?" Eleanor asked. "To tell the court what Arthur did for you and how you repaid him, I'd be on the next plane north." Frank replied without hesitation. "I owe Arthur everything. My family would have been on the street if not for him." As Eleanor prepared for the hearing, Sloane made one last attempt to seize control. She invited Eleanor to dinner at an upscale restaurant, just the two of them. Against Julian's advice, Eleanor accepted. The restaurant was crowded and dimly lit conversations providing a blanket of background noise. Sloane was already seated when Eleanor arrived, looking elegant and composed as always. "Thank you for meeting me, Eleanor." Sloane's smile never reached her eyes. "I thought it might be good for us to speak directly woman to woman." Eleanor sat down, her posture perfect despite her years. "I agree. No more proxies. No more games." Sloane sipped her wine, studying Eleanor over the rim of the glass. "You know, I've always admired your resilience. Most women your age would have crumbled by now." "You didn't invite me here to compliment me," Eleanor replied evenly. "What do you want, Sloane?" Sloane set down her glass with precision. "I want to offer you a deal. A way for both of us to get what we need with minimal damage. I'm listening. Withdraw your objections to the conservatorship. Allow Parker to manage your affairs. In return, I'll ensure you live comfortably in your own home for the rest of your days. No nursing home. No public humiliation. The Langford name remains untarnished." "And Arthur's pension fund?" Eleanor asked. A flicker of something cold passed behind Sloane's eyes. "The audit proceeds. That's non-negotiable." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "You don't actually care about the money, do you? This is about punishing a dead man by destroying his reputation." Sloane's mask slipped just for an instant. "What I care about is justice. Your husband ruined my father, made him a pariah, made us outcasts. My mother had to clean houses to keep food on the table, while Arthur Langford was celebrated as a champion of working men. Your father stole from those same working men," Eleanor countered. "He bypassed safety measures that cost another man his fingers. Arthur didn't ruin him. He did that himself." Sloane leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My father made mistakes. Arthur made him pay with his life, his reputation, everything. Now it's my turn to collect. One way or another, the Langford legacy ends in disgrace. The only question is whether you go down with it." Eleanor met Sloane's gaze without flinching. "You've waited 40 years for this, planned it meticulously. But you made one critical mistake. And what's that?" "You assumed I was just an old woman protecting her husband's memory." Eleanor's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "But I was a fighter long before I was a widow. You're not the first person who's tried to take what's mine, and like all the others, you're going to fail." Sloane's smile turned predatory. "We'll see about that." The day of the competency hearing dawned clear and cold. The courtroom was the same, but the atmosphere was entirely different. This was no preliminary skirmish. This was the decisive battle. Eleanor sat beside Julian, calm and focused. Across the aisle, Sloane projected her usual aura of confident control, while Parker sat behind her, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Judge Espinosa called the court to order, and Julian rose to speak. Your Honor, before we address my client's competency, we must first address the fraudulent evidence submitted at the last hearing. I would like to call Mr. Alex Sharma to the stand. Alex testified for over 20 minutes, explaining in clear, accessible terms how the recordings had been manipulated. He showed spectrograms, comparing authentic speech patterns with the fabricated ones, pointing out the telltale signs of digital manipulation. Most damning of all, he traced the digital artifacts in the manipulated files to a specific commercial AI voice cloning program, a program whose premium subscription was registered to Mercer Public Relations, Sloane Mercer Langford's company. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Espinosa's expression hardened as she looked at Sloane, who remained impassive despite the bombshell. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor, Julian concluded, but he didn't return to his seat. Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Eleanor Langford, wishes to address the court. Judge Espinosa nodded. You may approach, Mrs. Langford. Eleanor walked to the witness stand, her steps slow but deliberate. She didn't feel like a 75-year-old woman in that moment. She felt like a general taking the field. She settled into the chair, adjusted the microphone, and looked not at the judge, but directly at Sloane. Your Honor, my son and his wife have tried very hard to paint a picture of me as a confused, incompetent old woman. They brought you fabricated evidence to support that claim. But their entire case, this entire ugly affair, is built on a much older lie. She lifted the Mercer file onto the ledge in front of her. This is the personnel file of a man named Daniel Mercer, Sloane's father. For the first time, Sloane's mask of composure cracked. A flicker of pure panic flashed in her eyes. Parker looked as if he'd been turned to stone. Daniel Mercer was fired from the Steelworkers Union in 1981. Eleanor continued, her voice cold and factual. He was not laid off. He was fired for cause. He was fired for embezzling from the Workers' Social Fund, and he was fired for criminal negligence that cost another man part of his hand. It's all in this file, the reports, the signed confessions, the evidence. Eleanor slid the file toward the court clerk. This whole sordid affair isn't about my health. It has never been about the money. Not really. This is a vendetta. A 40-year-old grudge held by a daughter who has built her life on the false belief that her father was a victim when in fact he was a thief and a disgrace. The courtroom was utterly silent as Eleanor turned to the matter of the audit. Sloane's lawyer has also made a great deal about a financial anomaly they discovered in the pension fund's early records, a transfer of $150,000 that was improperly documented. They would have you believe this is proof of my late husband's corruption. They are half right. It was improperly documented, but it was not an act of corruption. It was an act of justice. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather notebook. This was my husband's private ledger. In it, he detailed the real story. The money Daniel Mercer stole wasn't from the union itself, but from the disability and relief payments of the very family whose father he had injured. He was stealing from a crippled man. A collective intake of breath from the gallery punctuated this revelation. The union couldn't legally replace the funds without a lengthy and public lawsuit that would have bankrupted the Miller family in legal fees. So my husband made a choice. Eleanor's voice grew thick with emotion, with pride. He made a choice to do what was right, not what was easy. He personally authorized the transfer to make that family whole again, logging it as a ghost asset with the full intention of repaying it himself. He broke a rule to uphold a principle. He protected his own. That was the man he was. Eleanor finally looked directly at Sloane, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying across the silent courtroom. The audit you demanded, Sloane, the weapon you thought would destroy my husband's name, has done the opposite. It has revealed his true character. It has cemented his legacy. She leaned forward into the microphone, her eyes locked on Sloane's. My husband's legacy is honor. What is your father's? The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Sloane's face was a crumbling ruin. The mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly hatred of that little girl in the photograph. Parker finally broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The house of cards he had built his life upon had just come crashing down around him. Judge Espinosa simply stared, her expression a mixture of shock and profound understanding. The truth, once unleashed, was a weapon against which there was no defense. The dust from the courtroom explosion settled over the next 2 days. The court's verdict was swift and decisive. The conservatorship petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. Judge Espinosa issued a scathing rebuke of Sloane and her legal team for attempting to defraud the court with manipulated evidence. The audit was halted immediately. Eleanor was free, but she felt no joy in the victory. The damage to her family had already been done. Parker came to the house on Sunday evening. He came alone. Eleanor watched from the living room window as his modest sedan pulled into the driveway, a world away from the gleaming black SUV he used to arrive in. He walked up the path, shoulders slumped, a man carrying the weight of the world. Eleanor met him at the door and let him in without a word. They walked into the living room, the same room where this whole nightmare had begun, with carefully worded suggestions and false concern. The air was thick with unspoken words. The family photos on the mantelpiece of Arthur, of a younger, happier Parker, of Eleanor, seemed to watch them silent judges in their family's final trial. Parker didn't sit down. He just stood in the middle of the room, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. "Mom, The words caught in his throat, his voice raspy with emotion. He couldn't finish. "Sit down, Parker." Eleanor's tone gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. He sank onto the sofa. Eleanor sat in her armchair opposite him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. She had placed 2 items on the coffee table between them before he arrived. On one side was Arthur's old leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with his steady, honest handwriting. On the other side was the small, cold digital recorder that held the audio of Sloane's phone call with Howard Pike, the one Julian's investigators had uncovered, where they cheerfully discussed how they would carve up Eleanor's assets once she was locked away. Honor and greed sitting side by side. "This," Eleanor said, tapping her finger on the notebook, "is who your father was. He broke the rules, yes, but he did it to protect a man who was being crushed by the system. He lived to protect his people, to build something that would last." She pushed the small recorder across the table toward him. "And this is the world you chose to live in. A world of backroom deals and whispers, where a person's life is just a number on a balance sheet." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes holding his, forcing him to finally look at her. "Your father lived for others, Parker. What have you lived for?" A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. It fell onto his shirt, leaving a dark spot over his heart. "I'm giving you 2 choices." Eleanor continued, her voice, even though every word felt like a shard of glass in her throat. 2 envelopes, 2 paths. You will choose one before you leave this house tonight." She laid 2 plain white envelopes on the table between them. The first envelope contains a plan. It requires you to go to the district attorney's office tomorrow morning and give them a full, sworn confession. You will tell them everything you know about Sloane's plan, about Mariband Capital's involvement, about the deep fake audio. You will become the state's primary witness. You will face the music, whatever that may be. You will cut Sloane loose, file for divorce, and start your life over from absolute zero. I will help you with a small supervised living stipend, but you will not see a single dollar of inheritance for at least 10 years. It's a path back to being a man your father would recognize, but it's the hardest road you will ever walk. Parker's eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and a faint, desperate flicker of hope. The second envelope, Eleanor said, her voice dropping, contains a check for $50,000. It is the last money you will ever receive from this family. You can take it and disappear. Change your name, move to another state. I don't care. But if you walk out that door with that check, you are no longer my son. You will be written out of the will, out of the trust, out of our lives permanently. This door will be closed to you forever." He stared at the 2 envelopes as if they were a bomb and its detonator. the choice between a painful redemption and a painless exile. He finally broke. The sound that came out of him was a ragged, guttural sob of pure, undiluted grief. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking. It wasn't the cry of a man who was sorry he got caught. It was the cry of a man who finally understood the depth of his own failure, the hollowness of his own soul. Eleanor wanted to go to him to hold him like she did when he was a little boy who had fallen and scraped his knee, but she couldn't. She had to be the judge now, not just the mother. She sat there, her own hands trembling in her lap, and watched her son's world fall apart. It was not the sweet satisfaction of victory. It was the sharp metallic taste of surgery, cutting away a diseased part of her own family to save what was left. On the mantelpiece, a silver-framed photo of Parker and Sloane on their wedding day seemed to mock the entire room. It was a picture of a lie, and it had to be taken down. Parker's sobs gradually subsided. He wiped his face with his sleeve like he used to do as a child. He reached for the first envelope with shaking hands. He opened it and read the detailed plan Julian had drafted, a roadmap to confession and cooperation. When he finished reading, he folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I have to. I have nothing else left." Eleanor nodded a single sharp movement. The die was cast. She reached across the table and took his hand, the first physical contact they'd had since this nightmare began. The law offices of Markowitz and Beck Sloane's attorneys occupied the entire 45th floor of one of Minneapolis's sleekest skyscrapers. The view from the conference room was spectacular, offering a panoramic vista of the city below. But Sloane wasn't looking at the view. She was staring at the papers her lawyer had just placed in front of her. "These were filed this morning," Mark explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Parker has gone to the DA. He's giving them everything: the plan for the conservatorship, the connection to Marrowband Capital, the fabricated audio recordings. He's seeking immunity in exchange for his testimony." Mark tapped a manicured finger on the top document. "And this is the divorce filing. He's waiving all claims to marital property in exchange for a clean break." Sloane hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't shown any reaction at all. She sat perfectly still, a predator realizing it had become prey. How bad? Her voice was ice. Mark didn't sugarcoat it. Securities fraud, wire fraud, elder abuse, attempted financial exploitation, conspiracy, and that's just the beginning. The DA is talking about 8 to 12 years. They have your voice on multiple recordings discussing the plan with Howard Pike. They have the digital trail leading from the deepfake audio to your company's computers. They have Parker's testimony. It's... Mark hesitated, as if searching for the right word. "Comprehensive." Sloane finally looked up, her eyes flat and cold. "Options." Mark spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Take a deal if they offer one. Otherwise, prepare for trial." "But Sloane, I have to be honest, the evidence is overwhelming. No jury in the world—" She cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Can I still get to the pension fund? Is there any way to expose Arthur Langford?" Mark stared at her in disbelief. "That's what you're worried about, Sloane. You're facing prison time, serious prison time. The pension fund is the least of your concerns right now." A strange smile played across Sloane's lips. "You don't understand, Mark. I don't care about going to prison. I don't care about the money. I never did. I care about justice, about making Arthur Langford pay for what he did to my father." Mark sat back in his chair, suddenly seeing his client in a new and disturbing light. Sloane Arthur Langford has been dead for months. He can't pay for anything anymore. "He lives on in his reputation." Sloane hissed, a flash of that childhood hatred breaking through her polished exterior. "In his precious legacy, in the way people remember him. That's what I want to destroy. That's all I've ever wanted to destroy." Mark sighed and closed his portfolio. "Then I'm afraid I have bad news for you. The court has permanently sealed the audit findings. And with the counter-evidence Eleanor Langford presented, Arthur Langford's reputation isn't just intact, it's stronger than ever." The morning of Parker's testimony dawned clear and cold, one of those brilliant Minnesota winter days where the sun turns the snow into a carpet of diamonds. Eleanor sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as her son was sworn in. He looked different, thinner, older, but somehow more substantial than he had been. He met her eyes briefly before turning his attention to the district attorney. For the next 3 hours, Parker laid out the entire scheme in excruciating detail. He explained how Sloane had cultivated him from their first meeting, how she had drawn him in with praise and validation he desperately craved. He described her obsession with destroying Arthur's legacy, an obsession he hadn't fully understood until it was too late. He admitted his own weakness, his willingness to betray his mother for approval, for a sense of importance, for the illusion of love. The courtroom was hushed as he described the day at Maple Rest, the ambush with the documents, the moment when he realized he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to minimize his role. He told the truth, all of it, and in doing so, he began to reclaim a small piece of his dignity. When he finished, the judge thanked him for his testimony and informed him that in light of his cooperation, no charges would be filed against him. Parker nodded, but there was no relief in his expression. He knew that escaping legal consequences didn't mean escaping all consequences. Some debts could only be paid in other ways. Spring came reluctantly to Minnesota that year, as if winter was fighting a rearguard action against the changing seasons. But by early April, the snow had finally receded, revealing the first tentative shoots of green. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, coffee in hand, watching a pair of cardinals building a nest in the maple tree outside her window. New life emerging from the empty branches. Julian sat across from her, a stack of legal papers between them. He had aged during the past few months, the stress of the case etching new lines around his eyes and mouth, but there was satisfaction in his expression as he pushed the top document toward her. "It's over, Elle. Sloane took a plea deal yesterday. 5 years for fraud with another 3 suspended. She could be out in 3 with good behavior, but the financial penalties are severe. She'll lose everything, the company, the house, the investments, and she's permanently barred from any fiduciary role in the future." Eleanor nodded, feeling no triumph, only a weary relief. "And the trust, released from probate last week. The funds are completely unfrozen and back under your control, all $22 million plus interest." Julian hesitated, then added gently, "What about Parker?" Eleanor gazed out the window again, watching the male cardinal bring a twig to his mate. The bird placed it carefully in the developing structure, building something that would shelter new life. "He's in Chicago, working at a community legal aid center. They help seniors fight financial exploitation, guardian abuse, that sort of thing. The irony isn't lost on me." Julian smiled slightly. "Is he any good at it?" Eleanor felt a small warmth in her chest, something that might, with care, grow into pride. "Apparently he is. He's living in a studio apartment, taking the bus to work, eating ramen noodles for dinner, starting over completely just like we agreed." Julian nodded, understanding the unspoken question in her tone. "He's keeping his end of the bargain, Elle. He's doing the work, the hard work." Eleanor sipped her coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through her. 10 years is a long time, she mused more to herself than to Julian. A long time to wait for forgiveness. Julian's eyes were kind but direct. For some things, maybe that's how long it takes. The idea came to Eleanor gradually over the next few weeks. At first it was just a vague notion, a way to channel her energy now that the battle was over. But the more she thought about it, the more right it felt. She made an appointment with Julian to discuss it. A foundation. Julian leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal she'd just outlined. Using the pension fund to help elderly victims of financial abuse. Eleanor nodded, her expression animated in a way it hadn't been for months. "We'll call it the Langford Later Years Foundation. We'll provide pro bono legal aid to seniors facing guardianship abuse or financial exploitation, and educational workshops on how to protect themselves in the digital age. Think about it, Julian. If I had known about deepfake technology, if I'd been more careful with my digital presence, Sloane might never have been able to create those false recordings." Julian smiled, caught up in her enthusiasm. "It's a worthy cause, Elle, a real legacy project. Arthur would approve." Eleanor's eyes softened at the mention of her husband. "I think he would. He always believed in using your strength to protect others. This feels like the right way to honor that belief. They spent hours discussing the details, the legal structure, the funding mechanisms, the scope of services. By the time Julian left the Langford Later Years Foundation had moved from idea to imminent reality. Eleanor felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since Arthur's death. This wasn't just about protecting his legacy anymore. It was about creating something new, something that would outlive both of them. The following week, Eleanor received a letter. Not an email, not a text message, but an actual letter, handwritten in dark blue ink on high-quality stationery. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Sloane. Eleanor almost threw it away unread. What could Sloane possibly have to say that she would want to hear? But curiosity won out. She opened the envelope carefully, as if it might contain something dangerous. Eleanor. It began with no salutation. I hope you're enjoying the success of your little foundation. Such a nice legacy for Arthur. But have you ever wondered if that $150,000 was the only money he moved? Or if there are deeper secrets buried? All it takes is one stone to start an avalanche. Regards, S. Eleanor held the letter in trembling hands, but not from fear. It was a desperate last-ditch attempt to sow doubt to taint Arthur's memory, even as Sloane headed to prison. A pathetic final shot from a defeated enemy. Yet the letter prompted Eleanor to do something she'd been avoiding. That evening she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic again. This time she wasn't searching blindly. She knew exactly what she was looking for. The attic was warmer now that spring had come, the air less frigid but still thick with dust and memories. Eleanor moved purposefully through the stacked boxes until she found the one labeled Personal AL. Arthur's most private papers, things she hadn't been able to bring herself to look at after his death. She brought the box down to their bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed they had shared for 50 years. Inside were the expected items, old photographs, letters she had written him during his rare business trips, a few small mementos from their courtship. But at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was something unexpected, a small leather journal she had never seen before. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully. The leather was soft with age, the pages slightly yellowed. She opened it to the first page and immediately recognized Arthur's handwriting, though smaller and more cramped than his usual bold script, as if he were trying to fit as many words as possible into the limited space. It was dated 20 years ago. I've never kept a diary before, it began, but some things shouldn't trust to memory alone. Some debts need to be acknowledged, even if they can never be fully repaid. Eleanor read through the night, absorbing every word of Arthur's private thoughts. He wrote about the Miller family and the $150,000, his guilt at breaking the rules, his determination to make it right. But there was more, much more. Month by month, year by year, Arthur had documented his quiet atonement. Made another anonymous contribution to the pension fund today. Read an entry from 1992. That makes $300,000 total, twice what I originally moved. But it doesn't feel like enough. The interest alone would be more by now. We'll continue monthly payments. Later entries detailed additional contributions, each carefully calculated with compound interest. By the time of his final entry, just weeks before his death, Arthur had repaid the original $150,000 more than 3 times overall, anonymously funneled back into the pension fund. The last page held a letter never sent addressed to Eleanor. My darling, it read, if you're reading this, I've not had the courage to tell you myself, and now I never will. I hope you can forgive me for the secret I've kept. I used the fund's money to help Frank, yes, but I've spent the last 30 years making it right. Every month I've put 10% of my salary not into our savings, but back into the pension fund. Anonymous contributions more than paying back what I took with interest. I never wanted recognition. I just needed to balance the books, to know that I hadn't cheated the men who trusted me. I don't claim to be a hero, just a man who made a mistake and did his best to fix it quietly and without fanfare. That's the legacy I want to leave, not grand gestures, but steady, consistent effort to do the right thing even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. All my love, always, Arthur. Eleanor closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. In the quiet of their bedroom, she felt Arthur's presence more strongly than at any time since his death. He hadn't just intended to make things right, he had made things right and more. He had turned his mistake into a 3-decade commitment to integrity. It was a fuller, truer picture of the man she had loved, not the unblemished saint she had tried to defend, but something better, a good man who had fallen and risen again stronger for the experience. She carefully composed a response to Sloane's letter. Sloane, thank you for your inquiry about Arthur's financial activities. In fact, I have recently uncovered additional information you might find interesting. Arthur contributed anonymously to the pension fund every month for 30 years, ultimately returning more than 3 times the original $150,000 with interest fully calculated. He left detailed records of every payment. I'm truly sorry about what happened to your father. I understand the pain of watching a parent fall from grace, but we cannot live in the past. If you ever wish to talk not as enemies, but as 2 women who have been hurt by circumstances beyond their control, I would be willing to meet. Sincerely, Eleanor. She never received a reply. 6 months after the trial, the Langford Later Years Foundation was officially launched. Eleanor had insisted on a modest ceremony at a community center rather than an elaborate gala. The attendees were a mix of legal professionals, senior advocates, and ordinary older citizens interested in learning how to protect themselves in an increasingly complex digital world. Eleanor stood at the podium surveying the room with quiet satisfaction. At 76, she felt a new kind of energy, not the desperate strength that had carried her through the fight with Sloane, but something steadier, more sustainable. The foundation was not just Arthur's legacy or her own. It was something new they had created together even after his death. Julian introduced her with obvious pride, and the audience applauded warmly as she stepped up to speak. Thank you all for coming today, she began, her voice clear and strong. The Langford Later Years Foundation was born out of personal experience, my own battle against those who sought to take advantage of me because of my age. But it's about much more than my story. It's about all of us who have lived long enough to accumulate wisdom, but find ourselves navigating a world that sometimes seems designed to confuse and exploit us. She gestured to the foundation's logo projected on the screen behind her, a stylized lantern casting a protective light. We're here to be that light, to provide legal support when you need it, to offer education about the newest scams and technologies being used against seniors, to remind everyone that age should command respect, not make us targets. The applause was enthusiastic. As people mingled afterward, Eleanor found herself drawn into conversation after conversation with seniors, eager to share their own experiences and concerns. She listened attentively to each one, making mental notes for future foundation initiatives. As the event wound down, Julian approached with a surprise guest, Parker. He had driven up from Chicago for the launch, but had stayed in the background, uncertain of his welcome. He looked better than when Eleanor had last seen him, still lean but healthier, with a quiet confidence that was new. Their greeting was awkward formal, but not cold. Parker congratulated her on the foundation, and she asked about his work in Chicago. They spoke carefully around the edges of the deeper issues between them, like people testing thin ice. But it was a beginning, a tiny seedling that might, with time and care, grow into something stronger. As Parker was leaving, he paused and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small carved wooden figure, a knight from a chess set. It had been Arthur's part of the set he had taught Parker to play on when he was a boy. I found this in my apartment when I was packing to move to Chicago. Parker explained, turning the piece over in his hands. I think Dad would want it to be part of the foundation somehow, a reminder of what it stands for, protecting others. Eleanor accepted the knight, feeling its familiar weight and contours. Thank you, she said simply. I know exactly where it belongs. The next day, she placed the wooden knight on the reception desk of the foundation's new offices. It stood as a silent sentinel, a symbol of Arthur's legacy of protection and service, now extended to a new generation of vulnerable people. 1 year to the day after Arthur's death, Eleanor stood at his grave, a bouquet of his favorite wildflowers in her hands. The cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, dew still glistening on the grass. She had come alone, wanting this moment to be private, just between the two of them. I miss you every day, she told him, arranging the flowers in the small vase attached to the headstone. But I'm doing all right. The foundation is growing. We're helping people, Arthur. Real people who would have lost everything without us. Just last week, we stopped a predatory guardianship that would have stripped an 82-year-old retired teacher of everything she owned. Your legacy is secure, my love. Not just preserved, but expanded. She sat on the small bench facing the grave, enjoying the warmth of the summer sun on her face. Parker is doing well in Chicago. It's been a year of his 10-year penance, and he's sticking to it, working hard, living simply. Julian checks in on him regularly, says he's developing quite a reputation as an advocate for the elderly. He's found his calling, I think. A way to make amends that isn't just about punishment, but about growth. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Sloane is in prison. Minimum security, but still prison. I've thought about visiting her, trying to understand her better. I haven't done it yet. Maybe someday. The hatred she carried for 40 years, it consumed her, Arthur. Ate her from the inside out until there was nothing left but the shell of a person. I don't want to hate her back. That would be letting her win in a way. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the maple tree shading Arthur's grave, as if he were responding to her words. Eleanor smiled, feeling his presence not as a ghost, but as a continuation, a thread woven through her life that death had changed, but not severed. You taught me what matters, Arthur, not money, not even reputation, but doing the right thing, especially when it's hard, protecting those who need protection. I'm trying to live up to that lesson every day. She stood up, brushing a speck of dirt from the headstone, her fingers lingering on the engraved letters of his name. I'm not just preserving your legacy, my love. I'm building on it. And in the strangest way, I have Sloane to thank for that. Her attempt to destroy everything we built forced me to fight for it, to understand it better, to make it stronger. Eleanor took one last look at the peaceful gravesite, at the wildflowers, nodding in the breeze at the simple headstone that couldn't begin to encompass the man who lay beneath it. Then she turned and walked back to her car, back to the foundation, back to the work that still needed doing. The Minnesota winter that had seemed so endless a year ago would come again. The cycle would continue. But this time, Eleanor would be ready not just to endure it, but to find beauty and purpose in its stark contrasts. She had built her fortress not of legal documents and financial protections, but of truth, integrity, and service, and no one could take that away.